The cool evening air hung heavy over Elmwood Avenue, carrying with it the faint scent of fried food from Maya's diner and the tang of gasoline from the corner gas station. The neighborhood was alive but subdued, a place of resilience and quiet endurance. Children's laughter echoed faintly from a distance, competing with the occasional bark of a restless dog. It was a block where everyone knew each other, where lives intertwined amidst the cracks in the pavement and the graffiti-tagged walls. Marcus Green tapped his cane lightly against the sidewalk as he walked, the rhythmic sound blending into the ambient noise of the street. His movements were deliberate, his steps measured. Marcus, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, had been blind for almost a decade, but his lack of sight didn't define him. A former Navy SEAL, he had honed his other senses to perfection, his world painted not in light and shadow but in vibrations, sounds, and scents. As he approached Maya's diner, the hum of quiet conversation inside reached his ears. The familiar bell above the door jingled as he entered. "Evening, Marcus," Maya called, her warm voice cutting through the low murmur. She was standing behind the counter, wiping her hands on a towel. Her kind eyes and sharp wit had made her diner the heart of the neighborhood. "Evening, Maya," Marcus replied, tipping his head in her direction. He made his way to his usual booth near the window, where the smell of coffee and fresh pie wrapped around him like an old friend. As he settled in, the tension in the air caught his attention. The conversations around him were quieter than usual, tinged with unease. Marcus tilted his head slightly, picking up fragments of words from a nearby table. "Victor's gang again. They hit the Martinez place last night. Police aren't doing anything. We're on our own." Marcus frowned. He had heard the name Victor Kane whispered in hushed tones throughout the neighborhood. The man was a notorious gang leader, his influence spreading like a shadow over Elmwood. Maya approached with a coffee pot in hand. "You've heard about Victor, haven't you?" she asked, pouring him a cup without waiting for an answer. "I've heard enough," Marcus replied, "but it sounds like things are getting worse." Maya sighed, sliding into the seat across from him. "Worse is an understatement. His men are shaking down local businesses, vandalizing homes. People are scared, Marcus. And the cops, well, you know how it is." Marcus nodded. He knew all too well how the system often turned a blind eye to neighborhoods like Elmwood. "Anything specific tonight?" he asked. Maya hesitated. "Jenkins' hardware store. They smashed his windows yesterday. He's been trying to keep quiet about it, but it's got everyone on edge." Marcus set his coffee down, his grip tightening slightly. Jenkins was a good man, always willing to lend a hand to anyone who needed it. The idea of someone targeting him didn't sit right. "I'll check on him," Marcus said, standing. "Be careful," Maya warned. "I always am," Marcus replied with a faint smile. The street was quieter now, the laughter of children replaced by the faint hum of distant cars. Marcus made his way to Jenkins' store, his cane tapping against the uneven pavement. As he approached, he could hear voices, low and menacing, coming from the alley beside the shop. "Told you to pay up, old man. This is Victor's block now. I'll get the money. I just need more time." Marcus' jaw tightened. Jenkins' voice trembled with fear. Without hesitation, Marcus stepped into the alley. "Is there a problem here?" The group of 3 men turned toward him, their silhouettes faint blurs in his limited perception. "Who's this?" one of them sneered. "Another guy who doesn't know how things work around here?" Marcus tilted his head slightly, focusing on the vibrations of their footsteps and the weight of their voices. "I'm someone who doesn't like bullies." The leader laughed, stepping closer. "You're blind. What are you going to do about it?" Marcus didn't flinch. "Leave. Now." The laughter died down, replaced by the shuffling of feet. The leader muttered something under his breath, then signaled for his men to follow. "This isn't over," he said, his voice dripping with venom. As the gang retreated, Marcus turned to Jenkins, who was slumped against the wall. "Marcus," Jenkins breathed, his voice shaky. "You didn't have to." "They won't bother you again," Marcus said firmly. "But if they do, you let me know." Jenkins nodded, gratitude filling his eyes. "Thank you." That night, Marcus sat on his porch, the cool breeze brushing against his face. His mind was racing. Victor Kane's name had become a symbol of fear in Elmwood, but Marcus refused to let it consume the neighborhood. He tapped his cane against the ground, his resolve hardening. Victor didn't know it yet, but he had chosen the wrong block to terrorize. The morning sunlight spilled through the cracked blinds of Marcus Green's living room, casting long streaks across the worn hardwood floor. Marcus sat at his small kitchen table, his hand resting lightly on his cane, his expression thoughtful. Last night's confrontation lingered in his mind, not just because of the danger, but because it confirmed what he had feared. Victor Kane and his gang weren't just a nuisance. They were a storm brewing on the horizon. The neighborhood wouldn't survive if it faced that storm alone. A soft knock at the door broke his train of thought. Marcus tilted his head slightly, picking up on the faint shuffle of footsteps outside. "It's Maya," came a familiar voice. Marcus stood, walking to the door and opening it to find Maya holding a covered plate in her hands. "Thought you might like some breakfast," she said, stepping inside. "And maybe some company." He gestured to the table. "I could use both." She set the plate down, revealing a stack of pancakes topped with syrup. Marcus took a seat, but his focus wasn't on the food. "I heard what you did for Jenkins last night," Maya said, sitting across from him. "Word travels fast around here. Did it help?" Marcus asked. "Maybe," she admitted, "but it's not enough to stop Victor. Not yet." Marcus nodded. "That's why I need your help. Not just yours, Jenkins, Angie's, anyone willing to stand up for this block." Maya leaned back, her brow furrowed. "You think people are ready for that? Most of them just want to keep their heads down and hope this blows over." "They've been keeping their heads down for years," Marcus replied, his voice steady but firm. "And look where that's gotten us. If we don't fight back, Victor won't just take a slice. He'll take everything." Maya studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "All right, I'll help. But we're going to need more than just words to get people on board." Later that day, Marcus and Maya visited Jenkins at his hardware store. The shop was quiet, the broken window from the night before now boarded up with plywood. Jenkins, a wiry man in his 60s with a perpetually furrowed brow, greeted them cautiously. "Marcus, Maya, what brings you here?" "We need to talk," Marcus said. "About Victor." Jenkins stiffened, glancing nervously at the street outside. "Keep your voice down. If his guy's here—" "That's the problem," Marcus interrupted. "His guys shouldn't be the ones we're afraid of. Jenkins, you've lived here longer than anyone. You know what this block used to be before people like Victor moved in." Jenkins sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I remember. But those days are long gone, Marcus. Folks aren't the same anymore. They're scared." "They don't have to be," Marcus said. "Not if we stand together." Maya chimed in. "We're not asking you to fight. Just help us figure out how Victor operates. When his men come around, what they say, what they're after." Jenkins hesitated, his gaze flickering between them. Finally, he nodded. "I'll do what I can, but I'm not promising miracles." Their next stop was Angie's laundromat. The small storefront was bustling with activity, its rows of machines humming as customers folded clothes or chatted in low tones. Angie, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s with a no-nonsense demeanor, was behind the counter, tallying receipts. She looked up as Marcus and Maya approached. "Well, this is a surprise," she said, raising an eyebrow. "What brings the two of you here?" Marcus got straight to the point. "Victor Kane." Angie's expression hardened. "What about him?" "He's pushing this neighborhood to the brink," Marcus said. "But if we work together, we can push back." Angie crossed her arms. "And how do you figure that?" "Last I checked, Victor's got half the cops in his pocket, and the other half too scared to do anything. What are we supposed to do?" "Gather information," Maya said. "You hear things in this place, don't you? People talk." Angie smirked faintly. "Yeah, they talk. But that doesn't mean they'll do anything." "They don't have to," Marcus said. "Not yet. All we need is enough to understand Victor's operation, where he's vulnerable, what his next move might be. The more we know, the better chance we have of stopping him." Angie studied him for a moment, then sighed. "All right, Marcus. I'll keep my ears open. But if this goes sideways—" "It won't," Marcus said firmly. As the day turned to evening, The group met at Maya's diner to discuss their next steps. The air was heavy with anticipation as Jenkins spread a map of the neighborhood across one of the tables. Victor's been focusing on these blocks, Jenkins said, pointing to an area near the docks. That's where most of the trouble's been happening. Break-ins, threats, you name it. Angie nodded. And I've been hearing about a warehouse near the docks. People say it's where he runs his operation. Drugs, weapons, the works. Marcus frowned. If that's true, it's our best chance to gather evidence. But we can't go in blind. He paused, then smirked faintly. So to speak. Jenkins chuckled dryly. We'll need a plan. Distractions, maybe. Something to keep his men busy while we figure out what's inside. Maya crossed her arms. And what about the police? Are we just ignoring them? Not entirely, Marcus said. But we can't rely on them either. Victor's got too much influence. We need to gather enough evidence to force their hand, or better yet, expose the dirty ones. The room fell quiet as the weight of their task settled over them. We'll start small, Marcus said finally. Figure out his routines, his weak points. Then we'll go from there. Maya nodded. I'll spread the word. Quietly. See if anyone else wants to help. Angie tapped the map thoughtfully. And I'll keep an eye on that warehouse. If anything moves, I'll know about it. Jenkins leaned back in his chair. I'll rig up some old car alarms. They're crude, but they'll make enough noise to cause a ruckus if we need it. Marcus nodded, a sense of determination settling over him. Good. Let's get to work. That night, as Marcus sat on his porch, the sounds of the neighborhood wrapped around him. The distant hum of a radio, the laughter of children, the rhythmic creak of a rocking chair on a nearby porch. For years, this block had endured, surviving wave after wave of challenges. And now, with Victor Kane threatening everything, Marcus knew it was time to do more than endure. It was time to fight back. The sky over Elmwood was a muted gray, threatening rain. It matched Marcus Green's mood as he walked slowly down the block toward Jenkins' hardware store. His cane tapped a steady rhythm against the uneven pavement, guiding him. Despite the early hour, the neighborhood buzzed with an undercurrent of tension. Everyone seemed to be talking in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously toward the docks where Victor Kane's shadow loomed largest. Inside Jenkins' store, Marcus found Jenkins hunched over a workbench littered with tools, wires, and a tangle of old car alarms. He looked up as Marcus entered, wiping his hands on a rag. "Morning," Jenkins said, his voice gravelly but warm. "I've got something for you." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "What kind of something?" Jenkins grinned, holding up a small device. "Noisemaker. Trip this thing, and it'll give you about 90 seconds of ear-splitting chaos. Should be enough to draw some attention, or drive it away." "Perfect," Marcus said, running his fingers over the device to get a feel for its shape. "You've been busy." "You asked me to help," Jenkins replied. "And I don't like sitting around waiting for things to get worse." Marcus nodded. "Neither do I." Later that day, Marcus met Angie outside her laundromat. She had been keeping a close eye on the warehouse near the docks, and her notes were becoming increasingly detailed. Angie handed him a folded piece of paper. "I've been watching for a few nights now. This is what I've got so far." Marcus unfolded the paper, running his fingers over the raised ink where she had written down her observations. 2 shifts of men, she explained. 1 during the day, 1 at night. The most activity happens between 9 and 11 p.m. That's when the trucks come in. "What kind of trucks?" Marcus asked. "Big ones," Angie replied. "Box trucks, mostly. They're in and out fast. I couldn't see what they were carrying, but if I had to guess, it's something they don't want people asking questions about." Marcus frowned. "Drugs or weapons, probably. Either way, it's bad news." "There's more," Angie said, lowering her voice. "I overheard a couple of the guys talking about a big shipment coming in this Friday. Sounds like it's important." "Then that's when we move," Marcus said. Angie hesitated. "Marcus, are you sure about this? Victor's not just some street thug. He's got resources. He's dangerous." "I know," Marcus said, "but so am I." That night, Marcus sat at Maya's diner with Angie and Jenkins, the map of the neighborhood spread out on the table. "The warehouse is here," Angie said, pointing to a spot near the docks. The trucks use this alley to come and go, but there's another entrance on the west side. It's less obvious, but it's guarded. Marcus nodded. If we're going to get inside, we'll need to draw those guards away. Jenkins, that's where your noisemakers come in. I'll set them up near the alley, Jenkins said. One on the east side, one on the west. If we time it right, we can split their attention. And while they're distracted, I'll get inside, Marcus said. Angie frowned. You can't go in alone. I won't, Marcus replied. You'll be my eyes. I'll have my radio, and you'll guide me through. Angie hesitated but nodded. Okay, but if things go south, we're pulling you out. No arguments. Deal, Marcus said. Friday night came quickly, the air heavy with the promise of rain. Marcus stood in the shadows near the docks, his cane in one hand and a small radio clipped to his jacket. Angie's voice came through the earpiece. Trucks just pulled in, she said. It's showtime. Got it, Marcus replied. Jenkins, you ready? Ready and waiting, Jenkins' voice crackled back. Do it, Marcus said. A moment later, the first noisemaker went off, emitting a high-pitched wail that cut through the night. Shouts erupted from the warehouse as guards rushed toward the alley to investigate. West Side guards are moving, Angie said. Go now. Marcus moved quickly but carefully, his steps silent on the damp pavement. He reached the warehouse's west entrance and pressed his back against the wall, listening. Still one guard here, Angie whispered. Marcus tilted his head, picking up on the faint sound of footsteps nearby. He waited until the guard turned his back, then stepped forward, striking the man's leg with his cane. The guard collapsed with a grunt, and Marcus delivered a swift blow to his head, knocking him out. You're clear, Angie said. Marcus slipped inside the warehouse, the air thick with the smell of gasoline and wood. The faint outlines of crates and equipment loomed around him, casting long shadows under the dim overhead lights. Left, Angie directed. There's a stack of crates near the back. That's where the action is. Marcus moved carefully, his ears tuned to every sound. He could hear muffled voices deeper inside, men talking about the shipment. Boss says this one's worth a fortune. Don't screw it up. You know how he gets. Marcus crouched behind a stack of crates, listening. The men were loading boxes into a truck, their movements hurried but precise. Keep going, Angie said. You're almost there. Marcus crept closer, using the sounds and vibrations to guide him. He reached out, his hand brushing against one of the boxes. The wood felt rough, and he could hear the faint metallic clink of something inside. Got it, Marcus whispered into the radio. This is what we need. Time to get out, Angie said. But just as Marcus turned to leave, a voice rang out. Hey, who's there? Marcus froze as footsteps approached. Marcus Green crouched behind the stack of crates, his body tense as the sound of approaching footsteps filled the dimly lit warehouse. The voice was sharp, carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. Who's there? The man called again, his footsteps echoing off the concrete floor. Marcus pressed himself further into the shadows, gripping his cane tightly. His mind raced as he mapped out the room in his head. Every step he'd taken, every sound he'd heard, they painted a picture he could navigate, even without sight. Stay low, Angie's voice crackled in his earpiece. One of them is heading toward you. 2 more are near the truck. Marcus nodded slightly, his muscles coiled. He waited until the man's footsteps were almost on top of him, then moved. With a fluid motion, Marcus swung his cane low, hooking the man's ankle and pulling him off balance. The guard hit the ground with a grunt, and Marcus silenced him with a quick, precise blow to the head. Clear, Marcus whispered. But his victory was short-lived. From across the warehouse, another voice shouted, He's here. Over there. The sound of boots pounding against the concrete floor echoed through the warehouse. Marcus ducked behind a stack of crates, his breath steady as he listened to the chaos around him. Move to the east exit, Angie said urgently. I'll guide you. Marcus began to move, keeping low and silent as he weaved through the maze of crates. His heart pounded in his chest, but his mind remained sharp. He could hear the guards shouting to each other, their movements growing more frantic. Boss is gonna kill us if we let him get away. Marcus smirked faintly. Victor Kane's men were dangerous, but their fear of their leader made them sloppy. When Marcus finally slipped out of the warehouse, the cool night air hit him like a wave. He paused just long enough to get his bearings before breaking into a steady jog toward the rendezvous point. "Angie, I'm out," he said into the radio. "Good," Angie replied. "Jenkins is waiting for you 2 blocks over. Hurry, Victor's men won't stay distracted for long." Marcus reached the safe house, a rundown building Jenkins used as a storage space for his hardware business, and found Jenkins and Angie already inside. Jenkins was pacing, his brow furrowed, while Angie leaned against the wall, her arms crossed. "You're late," Jenkins said, his voice tense. "Ran into some company," Marcus replied, setting his cane against the wall. "But I've got what we need." He pulled a small object from his jacket, a USB drive he'd taken from the warehouse office. "What's on it?" Angie asked, her curiosity cutting through her usual calm. "Shipping manifests," Marcus replied. "Names, dates, locations. Enough to tie Victor's operation to every corner of this neighborhood and beyond." Jenkins let out a low whistle. "You're telling me that little thing could take him down?" "It's a start," Marcus said. As the group reviewed the information, the air in the room grew thick with tension. Every file they opened painted a clearer picture of Victor Kane's network. Drugs, weapons, extortion. It was all there, meticulously documented. But one name kept appearing in the files, and it wasn't Victor's. "Alan Beckett," Angie read aloud. "Councilman Alan Beckett." Marcus' jaw tightened. Beckett was a well-known figure in the city, a man who campaigned on promises of community revitalization and public safety. "That's why Victor's been so untouchable," Marcus said. "He's not just running a gang. He's working for Beckett." Before the group could process the implications, the door to the safe house burst open. Tony, Marcus' childhood friend, stumbled inside, his face pale and his breathing labored. "Tony?" Marcus said, rising to his feet. "Marcus, I need to talk to you," Tony said, his voice shaking. "What's going on?" Marcus asked, his tone wary. Tony hesitated, glancing nervously at Angie and Jenkins. "It's about Victor. About Beckett." Angie crossed her arms. "Spit it out. We don't have all night." Tony took a deep breath, then looked directly at Marcus. "I've been working for them." The room went still. "What?" Jenkins said, his voice sharp. "I didn't have a choice," Tony said quickly. "They threatened my family. I had to do what they said." Marcus' expression was unreadable, but his grip on his cane tightened. "What exactly have you been doing for them?" "Passing information," Tony admitted. "About you. About the neighborhood. I didn't want to, Marcus, but—" "You put all of us at risk," Angie snapped, stepping forward. "I know," Tony said, his voice breaking. "But I can help you now. I can tell you everything." The group debated furiously, the room filled with raised voices and accusations. Marcus remained silent, his mind racing as he weighed the risk of trusting Tony against the potential benefit of his knowledge. Finally, Marcus held up a hand, silencing the room. "Tony," he said, his voice calm but firm, "if you're going to help us, it has to start now. No more lies. No more games." Tony nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. "I swear. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." "Good," Marcus said. "Because if you betray us again, you won't have to worry about Victor or Beckett. You'll answer to me." That night, Tony shared everything he knew. He confirmed that Beckett was the mastermind behind Victor's operation, using the gang to control the neighborhood while lining his own pockets. "He's got a big shipment coming in next week," Tony said. "If you can stop it, you'll cripple his operation." "It's a start," Marcus said. But as he sat in the quiet of the safe house, listening to the faint sounds of the city outside, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that their fight was only just beginning. The early morning fog clung to Elmwood, muffling the sounds of the waking neighborhood. Marcus Green sat on the edge of his porch, his cane resting against his knee as he processed everything Tony had revealed the night before. Councilman Alan Beckett. The name churned in Marcus' mind like a storm. For years, Beckett had paraded himself as a champion of the community, making lofty promises about revitalization and safety. To learn he was the one orchestrating the chaos through Victor Kane's gang was a betrayal that cut deep. Marcus clenched his fist, the memory of Tony's trembling confession replaying in his head. Beckett's got eyes everywhere, Tony had said. Victor's just the enforcer. Beckett's the one pulling the strings. The fight against Victor was no longer just about protecting the block. It was about dismantling the entire machine. At Maya's diner, Marcus, Maya, Angie, and Jenkins gathered in their usual booth. The air between them was thick with urgency. Tony sat a few feet away, his presence met with quiet glares from Angie and Jenkins, who still didn't fully trust him. So, what do we know about Beckett? Marcus asked, breaking the silence. Plenty, Angie said, flipping open her notebook. He's been councilman for 6 years. Publicly, he's a saint. Charity work, community events, all the usual. Privately, he's got connections to some shady businesses. I dug up records of contracts awarded to shell companies with no real services. Jenkins crossed his arms. And let me guess, those companies lead back to Victor? Angie nodded. Exactly. Victor's crew handles the dirty work, and Beckett gets to keep his hands clean. Not anymore, Marcus said. Maya leaned forward, her brow furrowed. If Beckett's as connected as Tony says, going after him won't be easy. He's got power, money, and influence. Which is why we need proof, Marcus said. Not just whispers or rumors, something that ties him directly to Victor's operation. That night, Marcus and Tony set out toward the docks, their movements cloaked by the shadows of the abandoned warehouses. Tony had insisted he could lead Marcus to one of Beckett's key operatives, a man named Carlos who managed logistics for Victor's shipments. You sure about this? Marcus asked, his tone wary. Tony hesitated but nodded. Carlos runs everything for Victor. If there's anyone who can tie Beckett to this, it's him. The two men crept along the edge of the docks, their footsteps silent against the damp pavement. Marcus tilted his head, listening to the distant hum of machinery and the faint murmur of voices. There, Tony whispered, pointing toward a warehouse bathed in dim yellow light. Marcus nodded, his cane tapping lightly as he followed Tony's lead. Inside the warehouse, Carlos stood near a desk cluttered with papers, barking orders at a group of workers loading crates onto a truck. Keep it moving, Carlos snapped. We've got a deadline, and the boss doesn't like delays. Marcus and Tony watched from the shadows, their breaths steady as they took in the scene. That's him, Tony whispered. Marcus nodded. Stay here. Before Tony could protest, Marcus slipped through the maze of crates, his movements silent and precise. He listened intently, tracking Carlos' position by the sharpness of his voice and the scrape of his boots against the concrete. When Carlos turned his back, Marcus made his move. He grabbed the man's arm, twisting it behind his back and pressing him against the desk. Carlos started, but Marcus cut him off. Don't scream, Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. I'm not here to hurt you. I just want information. Carlos struggled, but Marcus tightened his grip. You're wasting your time, Carlos spat. I don't know anything. I think you do, Marcus replied. And if you don't start talking, things are going to get a lot worse for you. Marcus dragged Carlos into a nearby office, closing the door behind them. Tony followed nervously, keeping an eye on the workers outside. Who do you work for? Marcus demanded. Carlos sneered. Victor Kane. Everyone knows that. Don't lie to me, Marcus said, his tone sharp. Victor answers to Beckett. What's his role in all this? Carlos hesitated, his confidence faltering. I don't know much. Beckett gives the orders. Victor handles the muscle. That's all I know. Marcus leaned closer, his voice low. What kind of orders? Carlos swallowed hard. Shipments, mostly. Drugs, weapons, whatever they need to keep control. Beckett makes sure the cops look the other way. And the next shipment? Marcus pressed. Carlos' eyes darted around the room. Tomorrow night. Big one. Beckett's gonna be there himself to oversee it. Marcus released Carlos, shoving him back against the desk. You're going to stay out of the way, Marcus said. If you warn Victor or Beckett, I'll find you. Understand? Carlos nodded quickly, his face pale. Yeah, I get it. Marcus turned to Tony. Let's go. As they left the warehouse, Marcus felt the weight of the mission settling on his shoulders. Beckett wasn't just a threat to Elmwood. He was the rod at the center of a much larger system. And tomorrow night, Marcus would bring that system crashing down. Back at the safe house, Marcus relayed everything to Angie, Jenkins, and Maya. The team worked late into the night, finalizing their plan. "We'll need distractions," Jenkins said. "If Beckett's going to be there, he'll have heavy security." "I'll take care of that," Angie said. "I can set up across the street and keep an eye on the warehouse." Maya crossed her arms. "And what about you, Marcus? What's your role in all this?" Marcus leaned forward, his expression resolute. "I'm going in. If Beckett's there, I'll make sure he can't run." The room fell silent as the weight of his words sank in. "This could go bad fast," Maya said. "It won't," Marcus replied. "Because this time, we're ready." As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Marcus stood on his porch, listening to the quiet hum of the neighborhood. The battle ahead would be his toughest yet, but he was ready. Alan Beckett thought he was untouchable, hidden behind layers of power and corruption. But Marcus knew better. No one was untouchable. And tomorrow, Marcus would prove it. The night arrived shrouded in a heavy stillness, the kind that hinted at a storm waiting to break. Marcus Green stood near the edge of the docks, the damp air carrying the faint scent of salt water and gasoline. His cane tapped lightly against the ground, each step deliberate as he moved through the shadows. Through the earpiece in his ear, Angie's voice came steady but cautious. "Marcus, can you hear me?" "Loud and clear," Marcus replied. "I've got eyes on the warehouse," Angie said. "Beckett's men are everywhere. 2 by the main entrance, another pair patrolling the lot, and a truck just pulled up at the side entrance." "What about Beckett?" Marcus asked. "Not yet," Angie replied. "But if Carlos wasn't lying, he'll show." Marcus adjusted his grip on his cane, his mind already running through the plan. Jenkins had rigged the area with his improvised noisemakers, and Angie had positioned herself in a vacant building across the street to provide overwatch. Tony was stationed near the main road, ready to signal if backup arrived. "Jenkins," Marcus said into the radio, "are you in position?" "Ready when you are," Jenkins replied. "Good," Marcus said. "Let's do this." Inside the warehouse, the air was thick with tension. Crates were being loaded into a series of unmarked trucks, the men working quickly and efficiently under the watchful eyes of armed guards. Marcus slipped through the west entrance, staying low as he moved behind a stack of pallets. The hum of engines and the clatter of crates masked his movements. "I'm in," Marcus whispered. 2 guards ahead of you," Angie said. "You'll need to take them out quietly." Marcus crept forward, his ears tuned to every sound. He could hear the faint scuff of boots on the concrete, the rhythmic pacing of the guards. When he was close enough, Marcus made his move. He hooked his cane around one guard's ankle, pulling him off balance before delivering a sharp blow to the back of his head. The second guard turned, his hand going to his holstered weapon, but Marcus was faster. He stepped inside the man's reach, twisting his wrist and disarming him before knocking him unconscious. "Guards are down," Marcus said. "Nice work," Angie replied. As Marcus moved deeper into the warehouse, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the entrance. Angie's voice came through the radio, urgent now. "Marcus, Beckett just arrived. He's heading your way with Victor and a group of armed men." Marcus tensed. This was the moment he'd been preparing for, but the odds weren't in his favor. Beckett wasn't just another thug. He was a man who thrived on control and power, and he wouldn't give it up easily. At the front of the warehouse, Councilman Alan Beckett stepped out of a sleek black SUV, his tailored suit contrasting sharply with the grittiness of the docks. Victor Kane followed close behind, his broad frame and tattooed arms exuding menace. "This better be worth my time," Beckett said. His tone clipped as he surveyed the operation. "It will be," Victor replied. "We've got everything running smoothly. No hiccups." "Let's hope so," Beckett said, his gaze narrowing. "Because if this shipment doesn't go through, it's not just your operation that's on the line. It's mine." Marcus listened to their conversation from his hiding spot, the weight of Beckett's words solidifying what he already knew. Beckett wasn't just a corrupt politician. He was the architect of the suffering that had plagued Elmwood. He pressed a finger to his earpiece. Angie, can you get a recording of this? Already on it, she replied. As the workers continued loading the trucks, Marcus spotted a small office tucked into the corner of the warehouse. If Beckett and Victor were here, the office would likely hold the documents or devices needed to cement their downfall. Angie, I'm going for the office, Marcus said. Be careful, Angie warned. There's still a lot of movement in there. Marcus crept along the edges of the warehouse, using the shadows and the noise of the workers to mask his approach. He reached the office door, his hand finding the knob. But just as he began to turn it, a voice rang out behind him. Hey, what are you doing here? Marcus spun around, his cane raised defensively. A guard had spotted him, his hand already reaching for his weapon. Before the guard could draw, Marcus lunged forward, striking the man's wrist and knocking the weapon to the ground. They grappled briefly, the guard's strength forcing Marcus to dig deep into his training. With a swift elbow to the man's ribs and a strike to the temple, the guard crumpled to the floor. Marcus, are you okay? Angie's voice crackled in his ear. I'm fine, Marcus said, breathing heavily, but I need to move fast. Inside the office, Marcus found a cluttered desk piled with papers and a laptop. He quickly stuffed the documents into his bag and felt along the desk until he located a portable hard drive. Angie, I've got what we need, Marcus said. Good, Angie replied. But you've got company heading your way. Victor and Beckett are moving toward the office. Marcus slipped out the back of the office just as Victor and Beckett entered from the front. Search the room, Victor ordered, his voice sharp. As Marcus moved toward the warehouse exit, the sound of a car alarm erupted outside, one of Jenkins' distractions. Shouts filled the air as Beckett's men scrambled to respond. Marcus, get out of there now, Angie said. I'm on it, Marcus replied. The chaos outside gave Marcus the cover he needed to slip away, but as he neared the dock's perimeter, his path was blocked by Victor and two armed guards. You thought you could just walk in here and take what's mine? Victor growled, his eyes blazing with fury. Marcus stood his ground, his cane gripped tightly in his hand. I'm not here for you, Victor, Marcus said calmly. I'm here for Beckett. Victor laughed, a cruel sound that echoed through the night. You think you can take him down? Beckett owns this city. And you? You're just a blind fool who doesn't know when to quit. We'll see about that, Marcus replied. The fight was brutal and fast. Marcus used his cane with precision, deflecting blows and striking with calculated force. Victor's guards were strong, but their movements were predictable. Within moments, Marcus had disarmed one and incapacitated the other. But Victor wasn't so easily beaten. The man charged at Marcus with raw power, knocking him back against a stack of crates. Marcus gritted his teeth, pain shooting through his side as he steadied himself. You should have stayed out of this, Victor snarled, raising a fist. But Marcus moved first. With a swift, calculated strike, he drove his cane into Victor's midsection, forcing the air from his lungs. Victor staggered, his eyes wide with shock, before collapsing to his knees. You've already lost, Marcus said, his voice steady. As the sounds of police sirens filled the air, Marcus stepped back into the shadows, his job done for the night. Beckett might have escaped this time, but Marcus had what he needed to expose him. The storm was far from over, but the first cracks in Beckett's empire had appeared. The first rays of dawn crept over Elmwood, painting the cracked sidewalks and weathered buildings in muted gold. Inside the safe house, Marcus Green sat at the makeshift table with Angie, Jenkins, Maya, and Tony. A pile of documents and a portable hard drive lay before them, each item a small but significant piece of evidence they had taken from Beckett's operation the night before. This is it, Angie said, her voice tinged with both excitement and trepidation. Enough to make Beckett sweat. Enough to bring him down if we play it right. Jenkins leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Yeah, but how do we make it stick? Beckett's not just some thug like Victor. He's got connections, lawyers, and probably half the cops in his pocket. Marcus tapped the table with his fingers, deep in thought. We start by testing who we can trust. Ruiz is our best shot. Ruiz? Maya asked, raising an eyebrow. Marcus nodded. He's one of the few cops in this city who hasn't turned a blind eye to what's happening here. If we give him a small piece of what we've got, we'll see how he handles it. If he's clean, we move forward. If he's not, we find another way, Angie finished. That afternoon, Marcus arranged to meet Officer Logan Ruiz in a quiet park on the edge of the neighborhood. The air was still, the only sounds coming from the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant laughter of children playing. Marcus stood by a bench, his cane tapping lightly against the ground. He didn't have to wait long before Ruiz appeared, his uniform crisp but his expression wary. "Marcus," Ruiz said, his voice low. "What's this about?" "I need your help," Marcus replied. He held out a manila envelope containing a single shipping manifest and a few incriminating photos of Beckett's operation. Ruiz hesitated before taking the envelope, his gaze shifting between Marcus and the surroundings. "You know this is dangerous, right? If Beckett's as dirty as you're saying, this could blow up in your face." "I know," Marcus said, "but if we don't act, he'll keep tearing this neighborhood apart. I need to know if you're with us." Ruiz opened the envelope, his eyes scanning the documents. His jaw tightened as he processed the information. "I'll look into this," Ruiz said finally. "If what you're saying checks out, I'll take it up the chain. But you need to be careful. If Beckett gets wind of this..." Marcus smirked faintly. "He won't. Not yet." Back at the safe house, the group waited anxiously for Ruiz to follow through. Maya paced the room while Jenkins tinkered with one of his gadgets. "You really think he'll do the right thing?" Maya asked. "He will," Marcus said confidently. "Ruiz isn't like the others. He cares about this place." Hours turned into a day, and just when doubt began to creep in, Ruiz called. "You were right," Ruiz said, his voice firm. "Beckett's tied to everything. The shipments, the shell companies, even the bribes. I've got enough to open an investigation, but I'll need more to make it stick." "You'll get it," Marcus promised. The next night, the team regrouped to plan their next move. With Ruiz on board, they needed to hit Beckett where it hurt most, his public image. "We leak the evidence to the press," Angie suggested. "Expose him in a way he can't control." Maya shook her head. "That's too risky. If we push him too hard, he'll lash out. We need to dismantle his operation first, piece by piece." Marcus listened quietly before speaking. "Maya's right. If we go public too soon, Beckett will bury us. We need to focus on his supply chain. Take that out, and we cut off his resources." Tony, who had been silent for most of the meeting, finally spoke up. "There's another shipment scheduled for Friday night. Same warehouse as before. Beckett's men will be there to oversee it." "Then that's where we strike," Marcus said. The plan came together quickly. Jenkins rigged a series of distractions to keep Beckett's men occupied, while Angie prepared to monitor the operation from a nearby vantage point. Tony would provide intel on the guards' positions, and Marcus would infiltrate the warehouse to gather the remaining evidence. As the night of the raid approached, the tension among the group was palpable. Maya pulled Marcus aside before they left the safe house. "You're taking too many risks," she said, her voice edged with concern. "I don't have a choice," Marcus replied. "Beckett isn't going to stop until someone makes him." "But why does it have to be you?" Maya asked. Marcus hesitated, his expression softening. "Because I can, and because I won't let him win." The night was eerily quiet as Marcus approached the warehouse. The faint hum of a truck engine broke the silence, signaling the arrival of another shipment. Through his earpiece, Angie gave updates on the guard's movements, her voice calm and steady. "Two near the loading dock," she said. "Another by the office." "Got it," Marcus replied. Using the shadows as cover, Marcus moved swiftly, neutralizing two guards with precise strikes from his cane. He slipped into the warehouse undetected, his ears tuned to the clatter of crates and the murmurs of workers. At the center of the warehouse, Beckett stood with Victor, reviewing a clipboard. "This is the last major shipment for the quarter," Beckett said, his tone cold. "Make sure nothing goes wrong." Victor nodded, but his expression was tense. The events of the past few days had clearly rattled him. As Marcus crept closer, he overheard snippets of their conversation. "The cops are sniffing around," Victor said. "That green guy, he's making trouble." "Then deal with him," Beckett snapped. "I don't care how. Just make sure he's out of the picture." Marcus recorded their conversation on a small device Angie had provided, his heart pounding as he realized just how far Beckett was willing to go to protect his empire. But as he prepared to leave, the sound of a door slamming froze him in place. "Hey, he's here," a voice shouted. The warehouse erupted into chaos as Beckett's men scrambled to find Marcus. "Get out of there," Angie yelled into the radio. Marcus moved quickly, his cane striking out to disarm a guard who blocked his path. He ducked behind a stack of crates, his breathing steady despite the tension. "Block the exits," Beckett ordered. "I want him alive." Marcus smirked faintly. Beckett's mistake was thinking he needed to escape. Instead, he turned toward the heart of the warehouse, ready to face Beckett head-on. The warehouse was alive with chaos. Shouts echoed through the cavernous space, and the sharp clatter of boots on concrete filled the air as Beckett's men searched for Marcus Green. But Marcus wasn't running. From behind a stack of crates, Marcus listened intently. Every voice, every footstep painted a picture in his mind, guiding him through the chaos. His grip tightened on his cane as he heard Beckett's distinct, clipped tone barking orders. "Find him. I don't care what it takes. He doesn't leave here alive." Marcus smirked faintly. Beckett's desperation was showing. On the far side of the warehouse, Angie's voice crackled through Marcus' earpiece. "Marcus, you've got 6 men moving toward your position. Beckett's heading to the office. You need to move now." "Understood," Marcus replied, his tone calm. With calculated precision, Marcus crept through the shadows, disarming 2 guards with swift, silent strikes from his cane. He moved toward the office, where Beckett was holed up with Victor Kane. "Angie," Marcus whispered, "what's the situation near the office?" "2 guards at the door," Angie replied. "The rest are spread out across the warehouse." Marcus nodded to himself, formulating a plan. At the office door, Beckett paced, his hands clenched into fists. "This is unacceptable," he snapped at Victor. "How could you let this happen?" Victor's jaw tightened. "It's not my fault. That Green guy, he's not just some random blind man. He's trained." "I don't care if he's trained," Beckett growled. "You told me you could handle him. If this operation falls apart, it's on you." Victor's glare darkened, but he didn't respond. Outside the office, Marcus positioned himself near the 2 guards. He tapped his cane lightly against the ground, drawing their attention. "Who's there?" one of the guards called, stepping toward the sound. In one fluid motion, Marcus swept the man's legs out from under him and silenced him with a precise strike. The second guard reacted too slowly, and Marcus disarmed him before rendering him unconscious. "Office is clear," Marcus whispered into the radio. "Beckett's inside," Angie replied. "Be careful." Marcus pushed open the office door, stepping inside with deliberate calm. Beckett froze mid-rant, his eyes widening as he registered Marcus' presence. "You," Beckett spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "I should have known you'd show up." "Councilman Beckett," Marcus said, his tone measured. "You've been busy." Victor stood at Beckett's side, his fists clenched. "You've got a lot of nerve coming here, Green." "I could say the same about you," Marcus replied. "But you're not the one I'm after." Beckett's face twisted in anger. "You think you can stop me? You're nothing but a washed-up soldier with a cane. You don't have the power to take me down." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "I don't need power. I have the truth. And I have this." He held up the recording device, pressing play. Beckett's voice filled the room, replaying his orders to Victor and the damning details of his operation. Victor's face darkened as the recording played. He turned to Beckett, his voice low and dangerous. "You said I was protected, that no one could touch us. You lied." "Shut up," Beckett snapped. Marcus took a step forward, his presence commanding. "It's over, Beckett. The police are already on their way. You can't hide this anymore." Beckett's composure cracked. He lunged for Marcus, his face a mask of rage. But Marcus was ready. He sidestepped Beckett's attack, using his cane to knock the councilman off balance. "You think this ends with me?" Beckett hissed, staggering to his feet. "There are others, people more powerful than you can imagine. You'll never win." Marcus stood firm. "Maybe, but tonight, you lose." As the sounds of police sirens filled the air, Victor backed away, his hands raised. "I'm done," he said. "I'm not going down for him." Beckett glared at Victor, betrayal flashing in his eyes. "Coward," he spat. Victor ignored him, turning to Marcus. "This was never my fight. I'll cooperate." "You'll get your chance," Marcus said. The warehouse doors burst open as Officer Ruiz and a team of officers stormed inside, their weapons drawn. "Freeze," Ruiz commanded. Beckett tried to make a run for it, but Ruiz tackled him to the ground, slapping handcuffs on his wrists. "It's over, Beckett," Ruiz said. Victor surrendered without a fight, his hands held high as the officers moved in. As the chaos died down, Ruiz approached Marcus, his expression one of quiet respect. "You did it," Ruiz said. "We did it," Marcus replied. "But it's not over. Beckett's not the only one out there." Ruiz nodded. "We'll handle it. For now, get some rest. You've earned it." As dawn broke over Elmwood, Marcus returned to his porch, the weight of the night's events settling over him. The neighborhood was quiet, but there was a new sense of hope in the air. Beckett's empire was beginning to crumble, and for the first time in years, the block felt like it belonged to its people again. But Marcus knew the fight wasn't truly over. Justice was a marathon, not a sprint. And as long as there were people like Beckett in the world, Marcus would be ready. The news spread faster than Marcus Green had expected. By mid-morning, the neighborhood was abuzz with whispers of Councilman Beckett's arrest. Headlines flashed on TV screens and corner stores, radios blared updates about the police raid at the docks, and word of Victor Kane's surrender traveled through Elmwood like wildfire. At Maya's diner, the regulars gathered, the air thick with cautious optimism. Marcus sat in his usual booth, his cane resting against the table as he listened to the murmurs around him. "They really got him, huh?" one man said, disbelief coloring his tone. "About time," another replied. "That man's been robbing us blind for years." Maya approached Marcus with a fresh cup of coffee. "You should be proud," she said softly, sliding the cup in front of him. "I'm not done yet," Marcus replied, his voice calm but resolute. The neighborhood may have been buzzing with hope, but Marcus knew better than to let his guard down. Beckett's arrest was a victory, but it wasn't the end of the fight. Victor Kane's gang was still out there, fractured but dangerous. And while Beckett's fall had shaken the foundation of corruption, it hadn't eradicated it. "Angie Jenkins," Marcus said as they gathered at the safe house later that day. "We've dealt a major blow, but we need to keep the pressure on. Victor's men are scrambling, and that makes them unpredictable." "I've been keeping tabs on them," Angie said, flipping through her notebook. "Most of them are either laying low or trying to find new crews. But there's a handful still trying to hold on to their territory. We need to cut them off completely," Marcus said. "No resources, no influence, no chance to rebuild." Jenkins nodded, his expression grim. "I can rig up some surveillance around the neighborhood, keep an eye on who's moving where. Won't be perfect, but it'll help." "Do it," Marcus said. "And Maya, we need to keep the neighborhood united. People are hopeful now, but hope can fade fast if we don't back it up with action." "You've got it," Maya said. The next week was a whirlwind of activity. Jenkins installed makeshift cameras and sensors around the block, keeping track of Victor's remaining men. Angie continued gathering intel, her sharp ears picking up on conversations in the laundromat and whispers in alleyways. Maya organized community meetings, encouraging residents to stand together and rebuild what Beckett and Victor had tried to tear down. Through it all, Marcus worked tirelessly, coordinating the efforts and ensuring everyone stayed safe. His body ached from the battles he had fought, but his resolve never wavered. One evening, Angie burst into the safe house, her face flushed with urgency. "Marcus," she said, holding up a piece of paper, "I overheard something big. Victor's second-in-command, a guy named Reyes, is trying to regroup what's left of the gang. He's planning to make a move tomorrow night." "Where?" Marcus asked, his tone sharp. "An old warehouse on 3rd and Pine," Angie replied. "They're meeting to discuss how to take back control." Marcus nodded. "Then we stop them." The plan came together quickly. Jenkins rigged more of his noisemakers to create distractions, while Angie scouted the warehouse to confirm Reyes' presence. Tony volunteered to provide backup, eager to prove himself after his betrayal. "I owe you this," Tony said quietly as they prepared for the raid. Marcus placed a hand on Tony's shoulder. You've already started making it right. Just stay sharp. The night of the raid was cold and silent. Marcus and his team approached the warehouse under the cover of darkness, their movements precise and coordinated. Reyes is inside, Angie whispered through the radio. 6 men with him. They're armed. Got it, Marcus replied. Jenkins set off the first distraction. A loud, piercing noise erupted from the alley behind the warehouse, drawing 2 of Reyes' men outside. Marcus and Tony moved quickly, taking them down before they could raise the alarm. Inside the warehouse, Reyes paced, his voice echoing off the walls as he addressed his men. We've been hit hard, he said, but this is our block. Beckett's gone, but that doesn't mean we roll over and die. We rebuild, stronger than before. Marcus slipped into the warehouse, his cane tapping softly against the concrete. He could feel the tension in the air, the desperation in Reyes' voice. You're not rebuilding anything, Marcus said, stepping into view. The room went still. Reyes turned, his face contorted with fury. You've got some nerve showing up here, Reyes snarled. You think taking down Beckett makes you untouchable? No, Marcus replied, but it does make you vulnerable. Your boss is gone, your crew is scattered, and your operation is falling apart. It's over. Reyes laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. Not yet. He signaled to his men, and chaos erupted. The fight was brutal. Reyes' men charged at Marcus and Tony, their movements wild and desperate. Marcus fought with precision, his cane striking with calculated force as he disarmed and incapacitated his attackers. Tony held his own, his determination driving him to fight harder than he ever had before. Together, they whittled down Reyes' forces until only the leader remained. Reyes lunged at Marcus, a knife glinting in his hand. But Marcus sidestepped the attack, using his cane to knock the weapon from Reyes' grip. It's over, Reyes, Marcus said, his voice steady. Reyes glared at him, his chest heaving. You think this neighborhood belongs to you? It'll never be yours. It doesn't belong to me, Marcus replied. It belongs to the people, and they're done with you. As the police arrived to take Reyes into custody, Marcus stepped outside, the cool night air washing over him. Angie, Jenkins, and Maya were waiting, their faces reflecting a mix of relief and triumph. That's another piece gone, Jenkins said. And the block is stronger for it, Maya added. Marcus nodded, a faint smile on his face. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like they were winning. As dawn broke over Elmwood, Marcus stood on his porch, listening to the quiet hum of the neighborhood. The scars left by Beckett and Victor would take time to heal, but the block was already beginning to rebuild, and Marcus would be there every step of the way. The morning sun rose over Elmwood, casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalks and weathered buildings. The neighborhood was waking up to a new reality, one without Councilman Beckett's corruption or Victor Kane's reign of terror. Inside Maya's diner, the air buzzed with quiet optimism. The regulars huddled in booths, sipping coffee and discussing the latest news. Beckett's arrest and Reyes' takedown had made headlines, and the community was beginning to believe that change was possible. Marcus Green sat in his usual booth, his cane resting against the table. Maya placed a steaming cup of coffee in front of him, her smile warm. You did it, Marcus, she said softly. We all did, Marcus replied. But it's not over. Maya nodded. I know, but for now, let the neighborhood breathe. They need this moment. Marcus tilted his head, listening to the hum of conversation around him. She was right. For the first time in years, the block felt alive with hope. Later that day, Marcus met with Officer Ruiz at the precinct. The evidence they had gathered against Beckett and his operation had triggered a full-scale investigation. Several officers implicated in the corruption were already under suspension, and more arrests were expected in the coming weeks. Beckett's facing a mountain of charges, Ruiz said, flipping through a file. And thanks to your work, we've got airtight cases against most of his crew. Most isn't all, Marcus said. There are still people out there who think they can pick up where Beckett left off. Ruiz nodded. And we'll be ready for them. The precinct is cleaning house. It'll take time, but we're committed. You've got a lot of work ahead of you, Marcus said. But this neighborhood will stand with you, as long as you stand with them. Ruiz extended a hand, his expression resolute. We will. Marcus shook his hand, a silent promise passing between them. That evening, Marcus returned to the safe house, where Angie, Jenkins, Maya, and Tony were waiting. The group had become a family of sorts, bound by their shared fight for justice. Ruiz says the investigation is moving forward, Marcus said as he entered. Beckett's empire is crumbling. That's great, Angie said. But what about the neighborhood? There's still a lot to fix. Marcus nodded. We start by rebuilding trust. People need to know that this isn't just a temporary victory. They need to believe in a better future. Maya stepped forward. Then let's show them. We've been talking to the community, organizing meetings, planning cleanups. The block's ready to work together. And we'll be there to help, Jenkins added. The following weeks were a blur of activity. The neighborhood rallied around Marcus and his team, coming together to repair the damage left by Beckett and Victor. They repainted graffiti-covered walls, repaired broken windows, and cleaned up vacant lots. Small businesses began to thrive again as people felt safe returning to the streets. Through it all, Marcus remained a steady presence, offering guidance and support. His blindness, once seen by some as a weakness, had become a symbol of resilience. One afternoon, as Marcus walked through the neighborhood, he stopped outside Jenkins' hardware store. The sign had been freshly repainted, and the shelves inside were stocked with supplies donated by the community. Jenkins stepped outside, wiping his hands on a rag. Marcus, he said, a broad grin on his face. You've got to see this. I'll take your word for it, Marcus replied with a chuckle. Jenkins led him inside, where a group of kids was building birdhouses under Angie's guidance. They wanted to help, Angie explained. Figured this was a good way to teach them about taking care of their neighborhood. Marcus smiled. Looks like they're off to a good start. That evening, the neighborhood gathered at the park for a community celebration. Strings of lights hung from trees, and the air was filled with the smell of barbecues and the sound of music. Marcus stood near the edge of the crowd, listening to the laughter and conversation. Maya joined him, a plate of food in her hands. Feels good, doesn't it? She said. It does, Marcus replied. As the sun set, Ruiz took the stage to address the crowd. This neighborhood has been through a lot, he began. But tonight, we're celebrating more than just a victory over corruption. We're celebrating the strength of this community and the people who never gave up on it. The crowd erupted in cheers, and Ruiz nodded toward Marcus. And none of this would have been possible without Marcus Green, Ruiz continued. A man who reminded us all what it means to stand up for what's right.